Canadian politicians and their families are being directly threatened by foreign governments, and this has been kept under wraps since 2021 until this Monday when a lot was revealed. Now, this story is developing quickly with politicians and different diplomats potentially being expelled from the country, and fears that in doing so, we could spark a new international crisis. So let me get you up to speed, because once you understand this, everything else is going to make a lot more sense. And it all started this Monday when the Globe and Mail reported that the government had received a report from CSIS, that's Canada's security agency, saying that a Chinese intelligence service, Ministry of State Security, has taken specific actions to target Canadian MPs who are linked to the February 2021 parliamentary motion condemning Beijing's oppression of Uyghurs. So saying, okay, politicians and their families who are supporting policy that's going on in Canada are being targeted by China. The spy agency says that this officer sought information on an unnamed Canadian MP's relatives who may be located in the People's Republic of China for further potential sanctions. So the idea is there was someone from the Canadian embassy to China that said, okay, I want to know more information about this politician who has these views that I don't like so that I can find their relatives in Hong Kong, as we're later going to learn. Now, allegedly, the member of parliament who was targeted was Conservative member of parliament Michael Chong, and Chong didn't know that his family was being targeted until this reporting happened from the Globe and Mail. Chong was concerned that other members of the government knew that him and his family were being targeted and that he wasn't informed. Here's what he had to say just a couple of days ago about the matter.
We need to know when the public safety minister first became aware of this. We need to know when the foreign affairs minister first became aware of this, and we need to know when the PMO first became aware of this. And if it turns out that the ministers of the Crown were aware of this 2 years ago and did nothing about it, it suggests political calculations were at play. If ministers of the Crown were and their offices were completely unaware of this, this shows an appalling breakdown in leadership on part of the Prime Minister. The Prime Minister and the Prime Minister alone is responsible for the machinery of government. And for the Prime Minister not to know about this, not to be interested in this, I think indicates, calls into question the PMO's handle on the machinery of government. And that is an appalling lack of leadership and an appalling breakdown in the responsibility of the Government of Canada. And the fact that this individual continues to remain in Canada is inexplicable.
So this member of parliament, Michael Chong, who's worried that his family members in Hong Kong might be targeted as a result of his actions as a Canadian member of parliament, says we need to know when the government knew that him and his family were being targeted, and if they knew, why didn't they tell him, and why didn't they do anything about it? He says that potentially this looks like a political calculation. If they did know and didn't do anything about it, maybe that was to sort of promote a certain image ahead of the election that was coming up back in 2021. But then he also says that if they didn't know, then that in and of itself is a total breakdown of how parliamentarians should be notified about threats to their families. So did the Prime Minister and his office know about all of this at the time in 2021? Well, here's his response, and unsurprisingly, it kind of passes the blame off into a different organization and away from himself.
When did you learn specifically about this information about Mr. Chong?
I learned that following the media reports on Monday morning. I asked CSIS, what is this briefing? What is this supposed story that is out in the media from a leak? What do we know about it? We then retraced over the past couple of days what this was, that CSIS knew about certain things, didn't feel that it reached a threshold that required them to pass it up out of CSIS or give more than just a defensive briefing to Mr. Chong a few months later and then repeat in. But obviously, when it comes to an MP's safety, when it comes to their family's safety, we need to know, even if it's a mild concern or something that wouldn't otherwise hit a threshold that CSIS would feel it needs to be worked on.
So Trudeau essentially says that this was CSIS's fault, Canada's intelligence agency, for not notifying Michael Chong about the threats to his family, because CSIS didn't feel that the report met a certain threshold to pass it up to the Prime Minister's office, saying, hey, we never even got this information that was put together by Canada's intelligence agency. But when people knew and who knew is an issue that has come into major question, and it sort of has contradicted some of these previous statements from the Prime Minister. Let me show you this clip that was just revealed yesterday.
Who knew what when?
Mr. Speaker, I've just been informed by the National Security Advisor that the CSIS intelligence assessment of July 20th, 2021 was sent by CSIS to the relevant departments and to the National Security Advisor in the PCO.
Michael Chong's revelation in the House of Commons suggests that the Prime Minister's top security official was told 2 years ago that Chong had been targeted by the Beijing regime. And yet, the PM on Wednesday said CSIS back in 2021 did not flag such a plot. The government stuck to that explanation Thursday.
So it turns out that at the very least, Trudeau's national security advisor at the time was aware of these threats, and we know that based on the recent testimony of Trudeau's chief of staff, the sort of head of his office, that any serious information regarding interference that reaches his office would be seen by the Prime Minister. Here's what Trudeau said in response to this seemingly contradictory stories that are going on here.
Mr. Trudeau, you said previously that the CSIS report didn't make it out of CSIS. Yesterday, the National Security Advisor contradicted you, saying that it made it to the Privy Council office. Who told you it never left CSIS, and why did you come out and tell Canadians that?
When the media reports came out on Monday talking about threats to an MP and his family, I immediately turned to CSIS and to our intelligence agencies to find out exactly what the facts were, what was known, who knew it when. The intelligence agencies constantly receive information about threats to Canadians, to our institutions, from various sources, and they are professionals at making evaluations on whether a threat is serious or credible and what actions need to be taken following a given threat or assessment. They proceeded to go through their processes in the way that they felt was the right thing to do. But it's obvious now that those processes need to be changed, which is why I have said clearly from now moving forward, any threat, whether it's serious or credible or not, to a member of Parliament or their family, particularly from foreign sources, needs to be elevated to higher levels than it was. In terms of what I shared the best information I had at the time on Wednesday, both to Mr. Chong and to Canadians.
So there's a couple different things going on here. The Prime Minister says, this information never reached me. I never knew about it. I learned about it back on Monday. Now, regardless of what I said earlier in the week, where CSIS didn't even release it to anyone, at the very least, I didn't get anything. Maybe my national security advisor got this, but I never got this information. This is what he's saying as of now. And then he goes on to say, actually, the real problem here is the system. Why wasn't this passed to me? He says that regardless of credibility and the severity of the information or threats that CSIS has, they need to pass on that information to higher levels of government. He says that's what we need to be talking about. That's the real problem here. Now, this solution from Trudeau of passing all of this information directly to him whenever it happens, or at least to higher levels of government, isn't really workable when we consider the recent testimony of the head of CSIS, who had to testify in front of the House Procedures Committee related to Chinese interference questioning that's going on right now. Now, that CSIS head, the head of the CSIS, said that they receive countless pieces of intelligence each day with varying degrees of credibility and severity, and they take all of that into consideration when drafting reports that explain their current views on a situation and how it should be passed up to different levels of government. They use all of those little pieces of evidence and pieces of intelligence that have varying levels of credibility to form an overall picture that is then sort of shared with politicians. And so not every piece of information can be passed to the Prime Minister, but in this case, a report summarizing the CSIS concerns about these threats to Michael Chong and his family made it, at the very least, to Trudeau's national intelligence advisor, showing that it was serious enough for CSIS to sort of push it up the ranks and up the chain. But again, to be clear, Trudeau says that his advisor never gave him this information. Now, these statements technically could be true because of the difference between the PCO, the Privy Council Office, and the PMO, the Prime Minister's Office. These are two different bodies, and the National Security Advisor is in one, and the Prime Minister is in another one. We'll get into my thoughts on this in a second, but let me explain. The Privy Council Office is a non-partisan office that's responsible for the entire public sector, public services, right? And that is the body that the National Security Advisor is a part of. So not liberal, not conservative, just the Privy Council, the National Security Advisor is separate from any party. Now, one of the main jobs of this National Security Advisor is to advise the Prime Minister of any relevant information regarding national security, of course, right? But what Trudeau's saying now is that this National Security Advisor did not share this information with the Prime Minister or anyone in the Prime Minister's office. That is what the current statements are saying, to be clear, as of right now. But you have to wonder, is this just a big screw up from this National Security Advisor saying that he assessed the situation and that the Prime Minister didn't need to know about threats to another member of Parliament's family? Is that plausible? Or, and this is totally speculation, unfounded speculation, is there a certain don't tell me things that would look bad for me to know, especially ahead of an election, type relationship between the Prime Minister and his former National Intelligence or National Security Advisor? I think Andrew Coyne puts this very succinctly in this tweet, and it makes a lot of sense. He says, it's conceivable, it's possible, though unlikely, that the National Security Advisor and the Privy Council Office, knowing that China was attempting to intimidate an opposition member of Parliament by way of his family, neglected to tell the Prime Minister or Prime Minister's office for 2 years. He says that's possible, super unlikely, but technically possible. What's not really conceivable is that they would fail to do so after the story broke since Monday, because remember, Trudeau said, hey, I've told you what I've known on Monday, and it didn't go outside of CSIS, this report, which is different from what now the National Security Agency and Privy Council Office are saying, which is that, hey, this was passed to, at the very least, the National Security Advisor of Trudeau. So I think that puts it pretty well. Now, the other element of this story is that the person who made these threats and was trying to get more information about Michael Chong's family in Hong Kong in order to apply pressure to them, well, the other element here is that person who was doing that work in Canada as a diplomat in Canada still remains as a diplomat in Canada. They still have their diplomatic status, and they have not been expelled, even though the government, or at the very least the National Security Advisor, knew this was going on since 2021.
What difference would it have made had you known this information at the time instead of, 2 years later?
I would have immediately called for this individual's removal from Canada so that this individual could not continue the coercive, clandestine, and clandestine work that they've been conducting in Canada with immunity. It's astounding that the government hasn't taken action to expel this individual. This individual, let's be clear here, this individual is a diplomat in name only. This individual is a foreign intelligence officer whose job it is to coerce and subvert our democracy. And for the government of Canada to continue to credit this individual and allow this individual to remain in Canada is a complete abdication of responsibility.
Hello, Prime Minister. The Foreign Minister says Canada is considering the expulsion of a Chinese diplomat. Why hasn't this happened yet, given that multiple MPs have allegedly been threatened by China?
This is a big step, not a small step, to expel diplomats. It's one that has to be taken with due consideration on all the potential impacts and all the very clear messages that it will send. This is something that the Minister is looking at very carefully, looking at all the information around it, and she will make a decision in due course.
So Michael Chong, the MP whose family has been threatened, says this person should have been expelled years ago, but on the other hand, Trudeau says that we have to consider the message that this sends to China, and that Melanie Joly, who is the Minister for Foreign Affairs, will make that decision soon. But when it comes to Melanie Joly's decision, it seems that whether or not threats were made is not the only consideration that is being considered when it comes to making her decision. I want to cut to this clip that is actually an exchange between Michael Chong and Foreign Affairs Minister Melanie Joly that has a very tense back and forth between the two. Let me just show you, and then I'll talk about it afterwards. I think you're going to be surprised.
Do you, Minister, continue to allow this diplomat to be accredited in this country on Canadian soil? That is the question. and you
Okay.
haven't answered the question.
Well, let me be able to answer the question. And of course, Michael, I understand your frustration and I understand your anger. So
We haven't expelled a single PRC diplomat.
Can I just
We are
finish?
one of the only democratic
Mr.
allies in the
Speaker.
NATO alliance that has not expelled
Chair.
a single PRC diplomat. And Canadians are being targeted by the over 100 diplomats accredited
will you
here.
allow the
Yes,
minister to
okay, thank
respond?
you. So, first and foremost, what we're doing right now as a government is we're assessing the consequences that we'll be facing in case of diplomatic expulsion, because there will be consequences. I think it's important that Canadians know what we've learned from the two Michael experience is that, of course, China and the PRC will take action. These interests, including economic interests, consular interests, and also diplomatic interests, we need to make sure as well that we protect our democracy. And that is why we will take action in light of the facts that are being presented regarding your case and any MP that could be targeted. So that's why my deputy minister right now is meeting with the Chinese ambassador and summoning him, and that's why also we're assessing different options, including the expulsion of diplomats, because it is important that we take a decision.
Minister, just with respect to interests, economic and otherwise, I can't think of an interest more important to the Canadian state than the protection and the safety and the security of its own citizens
And I agree with
here
you.
on Canadian soil.
And I
that
agree with
trumps
you.
all other interests.
I agree with
It
you.
is inexplicable that this diplomat hasn't been told to leave the country already. And I would hope that the deputy minister is informing the ambassador that this individual, Mr. Wei Zhou, should be on the first plane out or declared persona non grata.
So clearly Minister Joly is not just weighing whether or not these threats were made and whether or not it actually happened, but they're actually also weighing what the response would be from China if they were to expel one of their diplomats. Obviously, China wouldn't be happy. Let me show you this, which shows you China's statement about this matter that they've made publicly from the Embassy of the People's Republic of China in Canada. Here's the response, and I'll remove my camera here so you can read it along with me. You can see everything that's being said. They say on May 4th, Chinese ambassador to Canada met with senior officials at Global Affairs Canada, and they set forth their position and protested strongly on the Canadian side's threat to expel the relevant Chinese diplomatic and consular personnel based on rumors of the so-called China interference hyped up by some Canadian politicians and media. They say that China's always adhered to the principle of non-interference in countries' internal affairs. Now, they go on to say that in an attempt to make political gains and draw attention driven by ideological bias, some Canadian politicians and media have been manipulating China-related issues, attacking and discrediting China, and that China strongly deplores and firmly rejects this. Now, they go on to say that China strongly urges the Canadian side to immediately stop this self-directed political farce, not to go further down the wrong and dangerous path. Should the Canadian side continue to make provocations, China will play along every step of the way until the very end. Very sinister sounding. Definitely feels like it's a little bit threatening there, right? So this type of stuff is what Melanie Joly is currently weighing the options about. So obviously for everyone in this world, it's hard to cut through what is propaganda and what is real and what is true, both for citizens of China and also for citizens of Canada and the US. There's much of this going on, right? But it seems to me, at least given the information that I know, that it seems like we're scared to take action against China because we're afraid that we might have another Michael situation where innocent Canadians are illegally detained and as a response against something that Canada has done that is not in China's interests or something that they don't like. But I, on the other hand, would suggest that if we overly consider this when looking at any of these types of situations, that we're suggesting that all the actions that were taken regarding the Michael situation worked perfectly, right? It's persuading us to think twice before doing something that wouldn't be in China's best interest, which I think is the entire goal, right? But this is just my take based on the information that I'm receiving through these videos that I'm I'm watching to try to make these compact videos so that you can stay up to date with what's going on here. Now, obviously, this is a developing story, and I'll keep you posted, so make sure to subscribe to the channel, hit the notification bell, all of that good stuff if you want to stay up to date with this sort of thing. But I'm curious what you think about it. What's your take? Do you think that the Prime Minister's hands are clean in this situation because he never got the information from his national security advisor, or do you think that there might be some sort of connection here that's a little bit more nefarious? I'm curious what you think. Let me know down in the comments below. I read every single one and I reply to a bunch of them. But with all that said, thanks so much for watching, everybody. I really hope this video helped you out at least a little bit, and I'll see you next time.